The world is never going to be the same again.
I'm worried about the world.
The mass chaos and crises that there was in the world, it's going to be just like that now.
This is not an accident.
How long is it going to last? Longer than even for those of you that have some cash in the bank, way past your cash reserves.
Out of 100 people, 4 will get the message.
This thing isn't going to be over in a few weeks. This thing isn't going to be over in a few months.
Next war that's never going to end. Now, when all you have is a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. And to central bankers, every problem looks like it can be solved with more money printing. And if it's not even really a problem. Now, throughout history, war has always been a good reason to create more money from thin air. And over the last few decades, the US central banks have created trillions of dollars to pay for never-ending wars, like the war on drugs, the war on terrorism, the war on poverty, etc. Now, for the last 2 years, it's been the war on the pandemic. But all of those look tiny compared to what the central planners and the central bankers have their eyes on next. Before the era of central banking began back in 1913, at least that was the creation of the United States Federal Reserve, wars have been very difficult to fund as most of the world was operating on a gold standard. So if a country wanted to engage in warfare and subsequently significantly increase their spending to fund that war, then their only option would be to come up with that excess money. And of course, the only option to do that was through increased taxation. You see, on a gold standard, without the ability to expand the monetary base, it's very difficult to fool the people. If you want to go fight a war, then you have to run large fiscal deficits, and then you have to increase the taxes on the people, on the population, and then of course subsequently tell them exactly what that increased tax bill is going towards. Now, of course, if they did that, the public would be against the extra taxation unless it was for a very good cause, which I don't think they could get through. Now, even if the public was sold on the idea, wars on a gold standard would be much shorter and on a much smaller scale, because the war would simply have to come to an end when one side ran out of gold reserves. Now, this phenomenon is demonstrated best by the chart that you can see up on the screen. Now, the world was on a gold standard until the year 1913, as you can see highlighted above. And the chart is measuring CPI inflation, consumer price inflation. And as you can see, the small upticks in inflation in the 3 wars before 1913, CPI spiked. But then it came back down, it started normalizing once the war was over, and you can compare those upticks to the wars fought after 1913, and you can see the benefits that governments have to fight endless wars when their spending is removed from the constraints of a gold standard. Since 1913, CPI has never really normalized, as we've never really been not at war. Wars not mentioned on the chart above include the Vietnam War in the 1960s, the 30-year-long Cold War with Russia, the war on terrorism, the war on drugs, and most recently, the war on COVID. Now, you can see this easily with the chart that I have on the screen, which measures the size of the military expenditure as a percentage of GDP of various countries. You can notice the wars fought after 1913, when governments were granted limitless spending through central bank credit creation and money printing. The military spending is much larger as a percentage of GDP. Now, this is because it's far easier to just print the money. You don't have to ask anybody for permission. They simply have no choice but to live with the increased inflation that it causes. Now, why do we always seem to be at war? Might be a good question you're asking. Well, wars are great for creating inflation and, of course, artificially high economic activity. They're useful also to distract the masses from what's really occurring behind the curtains. Remember, high inflation and currency devaluation is generally how governments choose to default on their debt when they're faced with massive amounts of debt like the US is facing right now, which is basically the point of no return, with a debt to GDP of 130% or greater. Now, all governments need to execute this deleveraging is the right distraction, right? They need the right distraction and the narrative to justify the debasement. In the 1940s, during the massive government deleveraging, they justified the high inflation as a necessary to fight the Second World War. It was the American people's patriotic duty to buy the war bonds, even though they were losing 15% of their purchasing power per year. Now, many believe that the inflation was all about fighting World War II, when in reality, it was the perfect opportunity for the government to deleverage and recapitalize their balance sheet. Remember, yield curve control didn't conclude until 6 years after World War II concluded. Wars being used as a scapegoat for other endeavors has been a frequent occurrence in the 20th and even in the 21st century. As soon as the Cold War ended, only a handful of years later, in 2001, the war on terrorism began, supposedly in response to the 9/11 attacks. Now, the war on terror was sold to the public because Iraq supposedly had weapons of mass destruction, but after decades of war in the Middle East and many lives lost, Iraq never ended up having any of those weapons of mass destruction. So was the war on terrorism really about fighting terrorism? Or was it really about declaring a war on a new enemy that could not be defined? Was it, the enemy couldn't be defined, they weren't in a specific country, and it's really a war that could never end, a faceless, nameless war, and it couldn't never end, it could never be won. Now remember, nations just need good excuses to continue to print money and feed the war machines. Many people underestimate just how much money we're spending on wars, even before the war on COVID. Now, it's commonly said that the US military backs the global reserve currency, which is the US dollar. So what does that cost? What does it cost to back the global reserve? Well, the US military consumes more than $100 million per day just of oil. $100 million a day just of oil that the taxpayer unknowingly foots the bill for. The US is spending roughly $700 billion per year on military spending to fund endless wars to defend their monopoly on the global reserve currency. Now, similar today in 2021, the US and most central banks globally are still trying to attempt to inflate away their debt through inflation or debasement of their currencies. In the name of fighting the war on COVID, that's what they're doing. Now, if we take a more granular observation and investigate where all this COVID money really went during the unprecedented amount of money created in 2020 and 2021 to fight this war on COVID, let's just break down a couple of the stimulus packages that were passed. Since 2020, the first relief package was the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act, or we could just call it Phase 1. It went into effect March 6th of 2020. It was an $8.3 billion package, massive $8.3 billion. But then on March 27th of 2020, there was another $2.3 trillion CARES Act, of which some people, not me, but some people received a check of $1,200. Thank you. Then PPP was signed into law on April 24th of 2020, and it was $484 billion. Then December 21st of 2020, the US Congress passed a $900 billion stimulus bill, where again, some adults, not me, but maybe you, received another $600 of the $900 billion. On March 11, 2021, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 was passed for $1.9 trillion for stimulus and relief. And then some adults, again, received another $1,400 check. That is if they earned less than $75,000 per year in this bill. And then recently, another $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill was signed into law just this past November 6th. Now, if we do some math and we add up all these checks that American people received, not everybody, some of them, maybe you, some of the money that you received, and we see what percentage of this newly created money they each received, we can see that the total amount of stimulus was $6.8 trillion. Most adults received a total of $1,200 plus $600 plus $1,400 equals $3,200. Now, there's roughly 330 million Americans in the country. About 250 million are classified as adults, maybe eligible for this type of a payment. If we take the total amount of stimulus, the 6.8 trillion, and then divide by the amount of Americans, we get an estimate of how much money adults would receive if the money was divided equally. So 6.8 trillion divided by 250 million Americans equals $26,356 per American. Now, each American adult received $3,200 in stimulus payments. So where did the other $23,000 per person go? Well, we can dive in. We can take a more nuanced investigation and attempt to include, there's also $500 payments that children, for children that each adult got. But it doesn't really change the percentages. Globally, central banks have stimulated the economy with around 30 trillion since the start of 2020, which is now starting to have negative consequences that outweigh the short-term benefits that we got. The population has begun to see through the hysteria and fear being pushed by the mainstream media, and are also beginning to question the record-breaking inflation that these stimulus packages have caused. Remember, the population has to be on board with the financial repression for the governments to do the deleveragings like they did in the 1940s. Now, after seeing those statistics, you'd probably be hesitant, right? If a government openly declared another war in the 21st century, one that would cost about $150 trillion and be largely funded by the private sector, you'd have to wonder what portion of that $150 trillion is really going towards the stated goal of the war, or the war on climate change. Well, here it is. Are you ready? The next world war is COP26. COP26 was the 26th climate change conference. It was held in Glasgow just this past November. It's put together by the United Nations, and prime ministers and presidents from most major countries around the world all came to talk about climate, except for China and Russia. Interesting that those two countries didn't want to tie their hands behind their back, right? Interesting. China's the world's largest polluter. They didn't attend the global conference on climate change. The second thing that's pretty interesting is that over 400 oil, gas guzzling, carbon producing private jets were flown by politicians to attend a conference talking about how to cut down carbon emissions. Kind of funny, the hypocrisy there. But their plans discussed at the conference is to transition to a net zero carbon emission for the entire world by the year 2050 in order to slow down the global temperature rise. Now, policymakers around the world believe that the rising temperature is man-made and believe that we can slow this trend to keep temperatures preferably to about 1.5 degrees by the year 2100, if we can get to a net zero by 2050. Now, at this COP26 meeting, the world leaders determined that we need to find between 130 to $176 trillion of money before 2050. Of course, if we want to save the planet. That's $5 to $6 trillion per year for the next 30 years. That needs to be supposedly, spent on renewable energy to save the goal. Now, this is an outrageous number for lots of reasons. Firstly, the global GDP is only 80 trillion a year. The entire tax base of the US economy, which is the largest in the world, is only 4 trillion in size. So finding an extra 5 to 6 trillion a year would be equivalent of taxing everyone in America twice what they already pay a tax. Now, they also plan on using a carbon tax to redirect the 24 trillion that's invested in fossil fuels that needs to be redirected to renewables by 2050. Could the recent MasterCard development be an avenue that our policymakers want to redirect our consumption towards more green purchases? The recent MasterCard development tracks every purchase that the credit card holder makes and allows customers to track their own carbon footprint. Now, these high-tech big data farming tools in the wrong hands have the potential to paint a very dystopian future for us, especially when viewed with the backdrop of every major Western superpower around the world investigating how to implement central bank digital currencies. Imagine if those two work together. Now, John Kerry, he's the US Special Envoy for Climate, he tells us that it's the private sector that's going to have to come up with the majority of this $150 trillion. So to put this into perspective, the total world's wealth is about 430 trillion. So finding an extra $150 trillion in the next 30 years is like trying to tax everyone in the world an extra 30%, when tax levels are already at their highest level. Now, if a miracle happens and policymakers are able to come up with this, $150 trillion, Bank of America has a warning for us, and they say, quote, decarbonization efforts could increase global inflation by up to 3% annually as central bank balance sheet funding increases by $500 billion annually, end quote. Now, B of A ran an analysis looking at what percentage of this 150 trillion green spending the central banks would have to directly monetize, and estimated what effect it would have on inflation. The most conservative estimate they simulated would cause an additional 1% annual inflation if major central banks have to only monetize 15% of that $150 trillion bill. Now remember, when the policymakers told us that the trillion spent for the war on COVID in early 2020 wouldn't cause any inflation, we got the highest inflation levels in 40 years. Now, when they're openly admitting that the 150 trillion will cause 3% inflation, what do you think is going to happen? I wouldn't be surprised to see that inflation significantly overshoot that goal. Now, there's also the issue of physical supply constraints. There's rare earth materials such as lithium, cobalt, nickel that will need to be required to build the green infrastructure. And not only is their plan economically unfeasible, but it's failing before it even gets off the ground. The EU and the UK have been leading the way with the globe's climate change agenda, and they're aggressively shutting down natural gas and nuclear energy plants in their own countries in favor of transitioning to renewable energy sources like solar and wind. But look how it's been playing out for them. Gas prices are up 1,000% in the last year alone. German power prices have risen by 400% in the last year, and they continue shutting down nuclear energy plants and relying on more unreliable sources of energy, such as wind and solar. Now, these decisions aren't only having an impact on energy prices, but also nitrogen prices, which is threatening to worsen the already rising prices of food globally. Now, the natural gas shortage has caused the price of ammonia to 10x, the price of nitrogen to triple. Now, when the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar nitrogen fertilizer company says, quote, "I'm afraid we're going to have a food crisis. The energy crunch has made fertilizer too expensive to produce," end quote. When he says that, people should really be paying attention. I know I'm certainly paying attention. Now, Brazil is the world's fourth largest food producer, producing about 20% of the world's food. And recently, their president, Bolsonaro, had this to say when discussing food fertilizers, quote, "I am warning you a year in advance. Due to the energy crisis, China began producing less fertilizer and the price has already gone up. It will go up more and there will be a shortage," end quote. Now, currently, around 30 million Brazilians experience severe food insecurity already, meaning they sometimes go an entire day without food. Now, this number has already increased from 10 million only 3 years ago in 2018. And it's becoming increasingly concerning to watch the experts completely disregard the negative impacts that this green agenda is having on the world. Overregulation never works. Now, I highlighted this when we broke down the energy crisis and power outages that swept California back in 2020. You can see the video up here. And California is one of the richest states is the richest state in the US. It would be the 5th richest country in the world if it was a sovereign nation. And meanwhile, it had significant power outages in 2020 and 2021, looking more like a third world country. And after attempting to lead the nation implementing a greener agenda by shutting down natural gas, shutting down nuclear power plants, and trying to move to 100% renewable energy sources. Now, if you want a complete breakdown of just how wasteful and harmful renewable energy sources are and why it's going to be nearly impossible for us to transition to using 100% renewable sources, check out that video where I do a deep dive on that topic. Now, like I said, central planning always fails. Right? Instead of just blindly trusting the science, policymakers need to start looking at the results. These terrible actions and regulations are having on the economy and the society. It doesn't matter how virtuous the global green initiative is painted. If people are freezing and starving to death due to an energy crisis, it's probably not a good plan. All right? B of A is openly forecasting the green agenda will be even more inflationary than what's being felt today. And this should serve as a significant warning to protect yourself with hard assets that act as an inflation hedge, like Bitcoin, precious metals, commodities. You choose the one that you like the best. In the 1940s, during the inflationary World War II era, the US population didn't have a store of value to protect their life savings in. Right? Gold was confiscated in 1933. But today, as we're living through another inflationary era, fighting world wars against COVID and now climate change, we have an outlet. Bitcoin gives every person on earth the opportunity to preserve your time and savings in a store of value that can't be debased. Christine Lagarde, head of the ECB, European Central Bank, calls Bitcoin, quote, the escape valve, and for a good reason. They use the escape valve and protect yourself from policymakers' destructive regulations. At least that's what I'm doing. What are you doing to protect yourself? What is the lifeboat that you're going into? Leave me a comment and let me know down below. As always, give me a thumbs up on this video if you like it. If you don't like the video, that's okay. Give me a thumbs down. At least leave me a comment down below and let me know. What do you think about this new style of doing more of a monologue video? This is how I used to do them until I got the whiteboard. I got some people telling me they like it when I go back to this style. Leave me a comment and let me know what you think about this video style. That's what I got for you today. Happy New Year's. To your success. I'm out.